They told him a wolf could never be loyal. Then it bled to save his life. Under the frozen gaze of the northern stars, a wounded hunter and a trapped predator faced an impossible choice: trust or die. What happened next would shatter every lie the village ever told about beasts and men. The biting winds of the northern wilderness carried more than just the chill of winter. They carried warnings, whispered like prayers from the lips of hardened men who had learned nature's lessons the hard way. Ethan, a hunter of few words but sharp instincts, had absorbed these lessons since he could first hold a bow. "Animals don't feel gratitude," Old Man Harkin would rasp, his voice like gravel underfoot, as he whittled a piece of oak by the firelight. His left hand, missing 2 fingers from a lynx attack, was a living testament to his words. Show kindness to a beast, and it'll show you its teeth when your back is turned. The village elders nodded in grim agreement, their faces lined with scars both seen and unseen. Stories were traded like currency around the hearth, of the farmer who sheltered a fox only to find his chickens slaughtered, of the trapper who freed a wolf from a snare and was later found with his throat torn open. The moral was always the same: wild things stay wild. Ethan had no reason to doubt them. He had seen the aftermath of a bear's rage, the splintered door of the miller's shed, the deep gouges in the timber where claws had raked in search of food. He had tracked wounded deer that turned on their pursuers with desperate, flailing hooves. Nature was not cruel, but it was unforgiving, and survival demanded a hardness of heart. Yet sometimes, when the fire burned low and the others had retired, Ethan would catch the glint of eyes in the forest, not the feral glow of a predator, but something quieter, something almost knowing. In those moments, a question would stir in his chest, buried but not forgotten. What if they're wrong? It was a dangerous thought. In a world where a single misstep could mean death, doubt was a luxury no hunter could afford. But fate, as it often does, would soon test Ethan's beliefs in ways he could never have imagined, beginning with a storm, a wounded creature, and a choice that would unravel everything he'd been taught. That night, as the wind howled through the pines like a chorus of restless spirits, Ethan sharpened his knife by candlelight. The blade caught the flame, casting flickering shadows that danced across the cabin walls, shapes that looked almost like wolves, watching and waiting. He shook his head, dismissing the fancy. Tomorrow would bring another hunt, another day of survival, in a world that demanded blood as payment for its mercy. But the wilderness had other plans. The forest held its breath that evening. Ethan moved through the skeletal trees like a ghost, his boots sinking into the fresh powder with muffled thuds. The setting sun bled crimson through the pine needles, casting long twisted shadows across the snow. He had been tracking a bull moose since dawn, but the trail had gone cold near the frozen creek. Now, with the temperature plummeting and the light fading fast, even the ever-present chatter of squirrels had fallen silent. It was the quiet that warned him first, not the ordinary hush of twilight, but the thick, prickling silence of a predator's presence. Ethan's hand drifted to the knife at his belt, his breath fogging in the air as he scanned the shadows. Then, a sound, not the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but a low, shuddering whimper, the kind of sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the gut. Ethan followed it, his pulse quickening with each step. Around a jagged outcropping of granite, half buried in snowdrifts, he found the source. The wolf was enormous, a grey phantom of the north, its fur matted with ice and blood. It lay twisted on its side, one powerful hind leg caught in the rusted jaws of an old trapper's snare. The metal teeth had bitten deep, staining the snow beneath it in ever-widening circles of crimson. Ethan froze. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat. A cornered wolf was one of the most dangerous creatures in these woods. He'd seen what those teeth could do to a man's forearm. But as he took a cautious step back, the wolf's head lifted. Their eyes met, golden. Not the flat animal glare he expected, but something deeper, something almost human in its intensity. The The wolf's gaze held no snarl, no challenge, only a silent, desperate plea that cut through Ethan sharper than the winter wind. "Help me." The air left Ethan's lungs in a rush. He'd looked into the eyes of countless animals before, the glassy panic of a deer, the dull resignation of a trapped fox. This was different. This was recognition. The wolf blinked slowly, its breath coming in ragged pants. A thin line of saliva dripped from its jaws, steaming in the cold. It made no move to lunge, no attempt to snap, just that unwavering stare, as if it understood the power it held in that moment, the power to condemn itself with a single act of aggression. Ethan's fingers twitched at his side. The village's warnings echoed in his skull like a chant. "Leave it, walk away. Nature takes care of its own." But another voice, quieter but insistent, whispered back, "What if it doesn't have to?" The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant cry of a raven. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. The wolf's ear twitched at the sound, but its eyes never left Ethan's face. A decision hung in the balance, as delicate as the ice crystals forming on Ethan's eyelashes. Then, moving slower than a winter sunrise, he knelt in the snow. Time crystallized in that frozen clearing. Ethan's fingers hovered over the snare's rusted mechanism, his breath coming in shallow clouds that hung suspended in the air. The steel jaws had bitten deep into the wolf's leg, the serrated teeth gnawing through matted fur to pierce the vulnerable flesh beneath. Dark blood oozed in sluggish pulses, each beat of the animal's heart spilling more of its life into the snow. "Walk away." The voice in his head sounded like Old Man Hawkins, gravel and certainty. This is how fools die, with good intentions in their throats and wolf teeth in their veins. Ethan had seen what happened to men who forgot their place in the wild. Just last winter they'd pulled what was left of young Tom Wilkins from a bear den. The boy had tried to rescue a whimpering cub. They buried him with only half a face, yet as he stared into the wolf's eyes, not golden now, but nearly amber in the dying light, he saw something that made his hand still. Not submission, not animal fear, calculation. The wolf watched him with an intelligence that raised the hair on his neck. Its nostrils flared, taking in his scent, not the blind sniffing of a beast, but the measured assessment of a creature weighing odds. When Ethan shifted his weight, the wolf's ears twitched forward, tracking the micro-movements like a gambler reading tells. Most chilling of all, it had stopped panting. No whimpers, no growls, just that unnerving, unblinking stare as if to say, "I see you, hunter, now choose." A gust of wind sent snow whispering through the branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a tree groaned under the weight of ice. The wolf's gaze flicked toward the sound for only a heartbeat, just long enough for Ethan to notice the scar running through its left eyebrow, pale against the gray fur, a mark from an old battle, a survivor. His knife was in his hand before he'd fully decided. The blade caught the last slanting rays of sunlight as he wedged it between the trap's jaws. Rust flaked away like dried blood as he pried, muscles straining against the stubborn metal. The wolf didn't move, didn't flinch. Only its tail gave a single stiff twitch, the barest acknowledgement of the knife's proximity to its vulnerable flesh. With a screech that set his teeth on edge, the trap sprang open. Ethan recoiled, boots sliding backward in the snow, knife raised in instinctive defense. His pulse hammered in his throat, every nerve alight with the expectation of fangs. The wolf did rise, but not to attack. Slow as winter dawn, it gathered its limbs beneath it. The injured leg trembled violently, barely touching the ground as it stood. Blood dripped steadily onto the snow, each drop a dark star against the white. For 3 heartbeats they regarded each other, hunter and hunted, man and myth. Then the wolf limped forward, not toward him, past him. It moved with deliberate, pained steps, heading not for the safety of the trees, but along the game trail Ethan had been following earlier. After 5 paces it stopped, looked back. The message was clear, this way. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew that trail, knew where it led, to the ravine, to the fresh moose carcass he'd been tracking all day. The wolf had known exactly where he was hunting, had likely been shadowing him for miles, and now it was leading him somewhere. The knife felt suddenly foolish in his hand. The forest exhaled. Ethan stood rooted in place, the knife in his hand suddenly feeling as useful as a twig against the enormity of what had just transpired. The wolf's breath formed spectral clouds between them, each exhalation a whisper of life persisting against the cold. It should have run. Every instinct, every lesson, etched into Ethan's bones by winters and loss, demanded that the wolf vanish into the gathering dusk, a grey shadow dissolving into the safety of the trees. Instead, it had turned back, not to challenge, not to threaten, to wait. The space between them thrummed with something Ethan couldn't name. Not trust, that was too simple, not gratitude, that was too human. It was something older, something that lived in the marrow of the world before men drew borders between tame and wild. A snowflake landed on the wolf's muzzle. It didn't shake it off, just watched him with those impossible eyes, eyes that had seen generations of hunters come and go, seasons rise and fall, eyes that knew the weight of the choice Ethan had just made. Then it moved, not the loping gait of a healthy wolf, but a stiff three-legged hobble that made Ethan's own muscles ache in sympathy. 5 paces. Stop. The mangled leg hovered above the snow, trembling with the effort of not bearing weight. Blood dripped a dark constellation onto the pristine white. Ethan found himself following before he'd decided to. The wolf led him not down the game trail, but across a frozen stream bed where the ice groaned beneath their weight. Every few yards, it paused, not from pain, Ethan realized, but to ensure he still followed. As they climbed the opposite bank, the wolf's claws scrabbled for purchase on the icy rocks. Without thinking, Ethan reached out. His bare fingers brushed the thick winter fur at the wolf's flank. A shock went through him, not from the cold, but from the living heat beneath his palm. The wolf's ribs expanded under his touch, its heartbeat a steady drum against his fingertips. For one suspended moment, the universe narrowed to that single point of contact. Calloused skin against wild pelt, the boundary between them blurring like ink in water. Then the wolf surged forward, breaking the contact, but when it glanced back this time, something had shifted in its gaze. The trees thinned as they ascended the ridge. Through the skeletal branches, the last embers of sunset painted the snow in hues of blood and gold. The wolf stopped at the tree line, its silhouette haloed by the dying light. Below them lay the ravine, and in its center, sprawled across the ice like a sacrifice, was the bull moose Ethan had been tracking all day. Its massive antlers were tangled in a mess of fishing line and rusted cans. Some trappers discarded garbage. The great beast had clearly struggled for hours before exhaustion and hypothermia took it. The wolf hadn't led him to prey. It had led him to waste, to human cruelty. The message was unmistakable. You are not the only monster here. As if to drive the point home, the wolf limped to the moose's carcass and lowered its head, not to feed but to nudge the frozen muzzle, in a gesture that looked eerily like respect. Then it stepped back, clearing a path for Ethan, waiting, watching. The wind carried the stench of decay and the sharper tang of the wolf's blood. Somewhere in the distance, ice cracked like a gunshot. Ethan's knife slipped from numb fingers, embedding itself upright in the snow. The wolf didn't flinch at the sound, just kept staring at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. In their reflection, Ethan saw himself clearly for the first time, not as hunter or protector, but as something far more complicated, something capable of both wounding and healing. The cabin walls absorbed Ethan's restlessness like sponges soaking up spilled ale. For 7 sunrises he found himself pausing mid-task, knife hovering over whetstone, spoon frozen halfway to his lips, his ears straining for the telltale crunch of paws on snow outside. Each morning, he'd open the door expecting to find some new offering, a blood-speckled grouse, a winter-starved hare with its neck neatly broken. Instead, only the mocking perfection of undisturbed snow greeted him. By the 3rd day, he began inventing excuses to patrol the ravine, checking snares, he'd mutter to no one as he strapped on his snowshoes. But the traps he visited were along the ridge where the wolf had vanished, freshly baited with venison scraps that remained stubbornly untouched. The forest had become a cathedral of absence. Ethan tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the wound had festered. Maybe the wolf had crawled into some hidden den to die alone, as wounded creatures do. Or worse, perhaps it had simply forgotten him the moment the trap released its hold, proving the villagers right after all. Animals don't remember kindness, only hunger. The thought clung like burrs to his wool coat as he chopped wood behind the cabin. His axe strokes grew increasingly erratic, splitting logs into jagged fragments that would barely fit the stove. On the fifth swing, the blade glanced off a knot and bit deep into the chopping block, a humiliating miss for a man who could once thread an arrow through a squirrel's eye at 40 paces. That night, he dreamed of teeth, not the wolf's fangs, but his own, elongated and yellowed, tearing into warm flesh that tasted of copper and juniper. He woke with a start, his hunting knife already in hand, the cabin's shadows stretching like hungry things across the floorboards. Dawn found him at the kitchen table, disassembling his rifle with methodical precision. The gun oil's acrid scent did little to mask another odor, something earthy and wild that lingered in the corners of the room. He told himself it was imagination. Then, on the 8th morning, the proof appeared. Not at his doorstep, but at the village's communal smokehouse, where the butchers hung their kills. Ethan smelled it before he saw it, the rich, gamey musk cutting through the wood smoke. There, tucked between two slabs of curing elk, hung a perfect white hare. No blood marred its fur, no trap marks distorted its limbs. The killing bite, a single precise puncture at the base of the skull, spoke of a predator far more sophisticated than the village's half-starved coyotes. Old man Hawkins squinted at it through his milky left eye. "That's wolf work," he rasped, poking the carcass with his ever-present walking stick. "See how the neck's not snapped? Damn things like to keep their meat clean." Ethan's pulse hammered in his throat as he noted the placement, not thrown carelessly on the ground, but hung with deliberate care on the lowest hook, at exact human hand height. The message was as subtle as a thunderclap, "I remember." As he reached out to touch the frozen fur, Ethan noticed what the others had missed, a single gray hair caught in the hare's claws, not from a struggle but placed there with intention. A signature. The butcher clapped him on the shoulder. "Lucky find. This'll make fine stew meat." Ethan said nothing. He was too busy counting the days in his head. 8 since the ravine, the exact time needed for a severe leg wound to begin healing. That evening, he left his best hunting knife on the stump behind his cabin. By morning, it was gone. In its place, a perfect circle of wolf tracks in the snow, surrounding a single drop of fresh blood that gleamed like a ruby in the dawn light. The forest had turned treacherous in the dark. Ethan's breath came in ragged clouds as he navigated the unmarked path home, the feeble glow of his oil lantern painting wavering circles on the snow. An early spring thaw had left the night air thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting bark, a false promise of warmth that made the remaining patches of ice doubly dangerous. His left boot slipped on a hidden patch of black ice, sending a jolt up his spine as he caught himself against a birch tree. The bark peeled away under his gloves like dead skin. That's when he heard it. Not the usual creak of settling branches or the distant howl of the wind, but a wet, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground itself, the kind of sound that bypasses the ears and travels straight to the lizard brain, where all primal fears live. Ethan's lantern flame guttered wildly as he turned. 20 paces away, swaying like a ship's mast in a storm, stood the largest grizzly he'd ever seen. Its muzzle glistened with fresh blood, not its own. Strings of saliva swung from yellowed teeth as it worked the air with its nose, tasting his scent. The massive hump of muscle along its shoulders bunched and rolled with each breath, its claws, longer than Ethan's fingers, leaving deep divots in the softened earth. The rifle strapped to his back might as well have been on the moon, time-fractured. Some detached part of Ethan's mind noted absurd details. a patch of mange on the bear's left flank, the way its right ear twitched incessantly, the half-healed scar running across its nose, marks of a creature that had survived countless battles. This was no young male seeking territory, but an ancient monarch of these woods, its black eyes holding the patience of something that knew all the ways a man could die. The lantern slipped from Ethan's numb fingers. It hit the snow with a muffled thump, the flame hissing out as melted water seeped into the glass. Darkness rushed in like a tide. The bear charged. No warning growl, no false starts, just 600 pounds of muscle and rage exploding forward with terrifying grace. Ethan's body moved before his mind could follow, diving sideways as the world erupted in a storm of flying snow and splintered wood. The birch tree he'd leaned against moments before snapped like a twig under the bear's passing bulk. Rolling to his knees, Ethan's hand found the hatchet at his belt. The blade looked pitifully small against the beast now wheeling toward him with frightening agility. He'd seen what those claws could do to seasoned hardwood. What they'd do to his ribs would be over in seconds. The bear reared up, blotting out the stars. Ethan braced for impact, just as a gray comet streaked from the underbrush. The wolf hit the bear's exposed flank like a living arrow, jaws clamping onto the tender flesh behind its front leg. The grizzly's roar shook icicles from nearby branches as it twisted, trying to dislodge the smaller predator. Ethan caught a glimpse of silver fur matted with old blood, the same leg injured by the trap weeks before the wolf went flying, slamming into a snowdrift with a sickening crunch. It didn't stay down. Shaking off the impact, the wolf circled with a limp that sent fresh crimson blooming across the snow. Its lips peeled back, not in a snarl, but in something eerily like focus, the same expression Ethan had seen on veteran hunters facing impossible odds. When the bear charged again, the wolf feinted left at the last second, those powerful jaws finding purchase on the grizzly's already wounded nose. The bear howled, swiping blindly. One glancing blow sent the wolf tumbling, but it rolled with the impact, coming up spitting blood and snow. Ethan's stomach clenched as he saw the damage, 3 parallel gashes along its ribs where the claws had found their mark. Yet still it advanced, not attacking now, but positioning itself between Ethan and the enraged bear, buying him precious seconds with its own flesh. The message was clear: run. Ethan's fingers tightened on the hatchet. He'd spent a lifetime believing in the villagers' wisdom, that animals acted only on instinct, that loyalty was a human invention. Now, watching this wounded creature stand against impossible odds for him, all those certainties crumbled like rotten ice. The bear gathered itself for another charge. Somewhere in the dark, the wolf let out a sound Ethan had never heard before, not a growl, not a howl, but something between a battle cry and a prayer. It was the most beautiful and terrible sound he'd ever known. Time fractured into crystalline shards. One moment, the bear's bulk filled Ethan's vision, its rancid breath hot against his face, claws raised for the killing swipe. The next, a silver streak erupted from the blackness between the pines, moving with the terrible precision of a lightning strike. The wolf didn't roar, didn't growl. It moved in eerie silence, a specter of vengeance given form. Its first attack was surgical, a brutal clamp of jaws on the bear's back leg, precisely where the thick hide thinned over tendon. The grizzly's answering bellow shook snow from nearby branches as it wheeled, swiping at empty air where the wolf had already been. Ethan's military training recognized the tactics. This wasn't wild animal frenzy, but calculated combat. The wolf harried the bear like a guerrilla fighter, darting in to inflict damage before vanishing into the night. Each time the massive paws swung, the wolf wasn't there, already repositioning to strike at the opposite flank. Blood bloomed in the moonlight, dark arterial sprays from the bear's hamstrings, brighter crimson from the wolf's reopened wounds. The dance of death unfolded with horrifying elegance. 1. The feint, wolf lunges left, drawing the bear's attack 2. The pivot, hind legs coil, launching its body sideways 3. The strike, fangs find purchase in the grizzly's already wounded nose. Ethan saw the exact moment the bear realized its mistake. This was no ordinary wolf. Years of surviving traps and rival packs had forged it into something more, a creature that fought not just with tooth and claw, but with the cold calculus of a war general. The grizzly changed tactics. Instead of chasing, it dropped to all fours and charged straight at Ethan, a battering ram of fur and fury. The wolf's reaction was instantaneous. It didn't intercept. It ambushed. Launching from a snowdrift, the wolf landed square on the bear's back, front paws gripping the hump, while its rear claws raked bloody furrows down the grizzly's sides. The enraged beast reared up, slamming backward into a pine tree with enough force to shower them both in bark and ice. Ethan heard the crack before he saw its source, the wolf's previously injured leg snapping under the impact, yet still it held on. Even as the bear bucked like a wild stallion, the wolf maintained its grip, jaws now locked onto the base of the bear's skull. The message was clear: to reach him, you go through me. Moonlight glinted off the saliva-streaked fangs, off the bear's blood matting the wolf's chest fur, off Ethan's forgotten hatchet lying halfway between them. Then, the miracle. With a final shuddering heave, the grizzly dislodged its attacker. The wolf hit the ground rolling, coming up in a three-legged stance, its broken limb dangling uselessly. The bear hesitated, panting heavily, its black eyes flicking between Ethan and the wounded guardian. Something passed between the ancient predators, some unspoken recognition that this fight would cost more than it was worth. With a last dismissive huff, the bear turned and vanished into the forest, its uneven gait leaving a trail of dark blossoms in the snow. Silence rushed back in. The wolf didn't immediately move. Its sides heaved like bellows, pink-tinged drool dripping from its jaws. One ear lay nearly severed, and its breathing came in wet, rattling gasps that spoke of broken ribs. Yet, when its eyes met Ethan's, there was no regret, no plea for sympathy, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. Then, impossibly, it limped forward and nosed the hatchet toward him with its muzzle, as if to say, "Next time, be ready." The forest became a cathedral of violence. Moonlight streamed through the skeletal pines, casting jagged shadows that twisted like living things as the combatants circled. The wolf moved with the eerie precision of a seasoned warrior, each labored breath sending plumes of vapor into the frigid air. Blood matted its silver flank, where the bear's claws had found purchase, the dark stain spreading with every heartbeat. Ethan watched, transfixed, as the wolf deliberately positioned itself between him and the towering grizzly. Its movements were calculated, never retreating, only shifting stance to compensate for the shattered hind leg that dragged uselessly in the snow. The wolf's remaining weight rested on three trembling limbs, muscles coiled like steel springs beneath sweat-dampened fur. The bear hesitated. This wasn't the frantic defense of cornered prey. The wolf's posture spoke of something far more dangerous. The cold, patient fury of a creature that had long ago learned pain was temporary, but territory was forever. When it bared crimson-stained teeth, the display held none of the typical animal aggression. This was a statement, a warning carved in flesh and bone. The grizzly charged. Snow erupted in great plumes as 200 kilograms of enraged muscle launched forward. The wolf didn't dodge. Instead, it pivoted on its good hind leg with unnatural grace, allowing the bear's momentum to carry it past while those powerful jaws found purchase in the tender space behind the grizzly's elbow. A scream tore from the bear's throat. Not anger now, but something closer to shock. It twisted violently, slamming its bulk against a nearby spruce. The impact should have dislodged any normal attacker, but the wolf held fast, its teeth meeting through layers of fat and muscle until they scraped bone. Ethan saw the exact moment the bear recognized its mistake. This wasn't just another forest predator. The wolf fought with the grim determination of something that had already stared death in the face and found it lacking. The grizzly's counterattack came in a flurry of swipes that would have disemboweled a lesser creature. One claw found its mark, opening a gash along the wolf's ribs that exposed the ghostly white of underlying bone. Yet still, the jaws remained locked, shaking violently to deepen the wound. Blood painted abstract patterns across the snow, splatters from the bear's arterial spray, steady drips from the wolf's injuries, the occasional dark pool where Ethan's own sweat fell from his clenched fists. The metallic tang hung thick in the air, mixing with the musky stench of bear fear and the sharp pine resin leaking from the wounded tree. Then, the miracle. With a final desperate heave, the bear wrenched free, stumbling backward several paces. Its breathing came in ragged, wet gasps. The injured foreleg now held awkwardly against its body. The wolf immediately collapsed, its body racked with tremors, but its head remained raised, eyes never leaving the larger predator. A silent conversation passed between them in that frozen moment. The bear's black eyes flicked from the defiant wolf to Ethan, then to the blood trail leading back into the safety of the forest. The calculus of survival played out across its scarred face. Was this meal worth dying for? With a last dismissive huff, the grizzly turned and vanished into the tree line, its uneven gait leaving a trail of crimson roses in the snow. Silence descended like a shroud. The wolf didn't immediately move. Its sides heaved with the effort of drawing breath, each inhalation producing a worrying rattle from damaged lungs. One ear hung by a thread of tissue, and its tongue lolled pink against the white snow where it had fallen. Yet when its eyes met Ethan's, there was no plea for help, no expectation, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed. Then, with a grunt of effort that spoke volumes about its pain, the wolf struggled upright. It didn't approach Ethan, didn't seek comfort or reassurance. Instead, it limped to the edge of the clearing and lifted its muzzle to the moon, releasing a howl that carried all the triumph and anguish of their shared victory. The sound echoed through the frozen valley, a declaration to the wilderness itself. This man is under my protection. As the last notes faded, the wolf turned and vanished into the trees, leaving Ethan alone with the blood-stained snow and the dawning realization that everything he'd been taught about the natural world was wrong. The cabin's hearth cast flickering shadows that danced like ancestral spirits across the log walls as Ethan worked. Moonlight streamed through the single frost-rimed window, painting silver stripes across the wolf's heaving flanks. Each labored breath sent fresh rivulets of crimson threading through the matted fur, the metallic tang mixing with the earthy scent of crushed yarrow leaves. Ethan's hands, usually so steady when field dressing game, trembled as he peeled back the clotted fur to assess the damage. The worst was the rib wound, a gaping valley of torn muscle where the bear's claw had scraped perilously close to the lung. Darker concerns lurked beneath the surface, the unnatural angle of the left hind leg, the way the wolf's pupils dilated unevenly in the firelight. "Easy now," he murmured, more to himself than his patient. The wolf's golden eyes tracked his every movement, but it made no protest as Ethan poured distilled juniper liquor over the wounds. Not even a whimper when the alcohol met raw flesh, just a slight tightening around those watchful eyes, and a single tremor that ran the length of its body. Something clenched in Ethan's chest. This wasn't the behavior of a dumb beast. No animal he'd ever encountered endured pain with such silent dignity. As he threaded the bone needle with gut string, memories surfaced unbidden. The village doctor sewing up old man Harkin after the logging accident. How the tough frontiersman had cursed and thrashed, despite the whiskey dulling his senses. Yet here lay this wild creature, allowing itself to be stitched back together by hands that could just as easily end its life. The trust implicit in that surrender was staggering. The wolf's breathing hitched as Ethan began closing the deepest gash. Its massive head lifted suddenly, teeth bared, only to gently take hold of Ethan's wrist in its jaws. Not biting, not even pressing hard enough to break skin, just holding. A silent request for pause. Ethan froze. The wolf's tongue, rough as cured leather, swiped once across his pulse point before releasing him. Then it settled back down, eyes slipping shut as if to say, "Continue." In that moment, the last of the villagers' dogma crumbled to dust in Ethan's mind. This wasn't some conditioned response or evolutionary trick. What passed between them in the firelight transcended instinct. It was the ancient language of mutual regard, spoken in touches and gestures older than human speech. The wolf remembered the trap's release, remembered the shared vigil over the moose carcass, remembered standing between Ethan and death beneath the indifferent stars. And now it chose to trust again. Ethan's needle moved with new purpose, each stitch a silent vow. When he splinted the broken leg with cedar slats and strips of boiled leather, the wolf assisted by holding the wood in place with its teeth. When he prepared a poultice of spider web and black birch sap to prevent infection, it licked the mixture from his fingers without hesitation. Dawn found them both exhausted, the cabin floor a mosaic of bloodied rags and herb remnants. The wolf slept at last, its head pillowed on Ethan's boot, not out of dependence, but because it had claimed that small contact as its right. Outside, the first birdsong of morning threaded through the pines. Ethan sat with his back against the hearth, watching the steady rise and fall of the wolf's ribs. Somewhere beneath the bandages and salve, beneath the scars and the struggle, beat the undeniable truth. Loyalty had never been about species. It lived in the space between actions, in the choice to stand when fleeing was easier, to trust when betrayal was expected, to endure pain for another's survival. The villagers would call it madness. Ethan knew it for what it was, the oldest sacrament of the wild. The changing seasons wove their partnership into the fabric of the wilderness. Where once Ethan had moved through the forest as a solitary hunter, his footsteps now echoed with a second, softer rhythm, the whisper of large paws compressing damp earth, the occasional click of claws on exposed stone. The wolf never walked at heel like a tamed dog, nor did it range so far ahead as a wild thing. It occupied the space beside him with quiet assurance, its presence as natural as the morning mist curling off the mountain lakes. Their silent language grew richer with each shared sunrise. A flick of the wolf's ears toward a stand of birch signaled a deer herd moving through the valley. 3 short exhales through its nose meant danger close. When Ethan paused to examine tracks, the wolf would circle upwind, becoming a living barrier against their scent being carried. The villagers' whispers grew louder than the wind in the pines. "You'll wake to those fangs in your throat," warned the blacksmith, eyeing the fresh scars on Ethan's forearms, not from attacks, but from the wolf pulling him back from thin ice last winter. The children dared each other to leave offerings at the edge of their property, a braided rope, a leather glove, once even a copper pendant, that the wolf returned to Ethan untouched. Old man Harkin spat tobacco juice near Ethan's boots. "That ain't no natural beast." He was right, though not in the way he meant. The wolf defied all categories. It refused cooked meat but would gently take an apple from Ethan's palm. It wouldn't enter cabins, yet slept, curled against Ethan's back when they camped under the stars. Most telling of all, it never vocalized at him. No barks, no whines. Their communication lived in glances and gestures, a dialogue older than words. One evening in late autumn revealed the depth of their symbiosis. Ethan knelt by a mountain stream filling his water skin. The wolf, normally vigilant, suddenly pressed its entire weight against his side, nearly knocking him into the current. Before he could react, it clamped down on his sleeve and yanked backward. The arrow, meant for his heart, struck water instead. The would-be assassin, Jed Carter, the trapper whose marked snares they'd been dismantling for months, swore as his bowstring twanged a second time. The wolf moved like liquid shadow, intercepting the projectile midair with a sickening thud as it buried itself in muscle instead of its intended target. Ethan's rifle spoke once. Jed's body hit the forest floor with the same finality as the leaves drifting down around them. Blood sheeted down the wolf's shoulder as Ethan scrambled to examine the wound. The shaft had pierced clean through, missing vital arteries by some miracle. As he broke the arrowhead off to pull it back through, the wolf licked the sweat from his temple, not in reassurance, but in shared fury. Their eyes met, and Ethan understood. This was no protector saving its human. This was a partner avenging their pack. That night, they didn't return to the cabin. Instead, They climbed to the high ridge where the northern lights danced green and violet across the sky. The wolf, bandaged but unbowed, sat upright beside Ethan as he built a fire. Its amber eyes reflected the flames, not with animal fear, but with something akin to reverence for this shared ritual. When Ethan finally slept, his head pillowed on his pack, he woke to find the wolf standing guard over him, not facing the wilderness, but the settlement below. Its message was clear. The true danger never came from the wild. It came from men who couldn't conceive of bonds beyond ownership. By first light, they were moving again, deeper into the untamed places where such prejudices held no power. Two hunters, two survivors, neither leading, neither following, bound not by leash or law, but by something far more enduring. The first snow of winter transformed the settlement into a tableau of hesitant wonder. Ethan's return at dawn was anything but quiet, his boots crunching through the frost-laden grass, the wolf's larger paws leaving deep imprints that steamed slightly in the cold air. They moved in unison past the stockade fence where sentries stood frozen at their posts, hands hovering near weapons that suddenly seemed foolish. The baker dropped his tray of morning rolls. The sound of porcelain shattering against frozen dirt cracked the stillness like a gunshot. Children's faces appeared at windows, their breath fogging the glass as they pressed noses against panes. Old man Harkin's pipe slipped from his lips, scattering embers across the snow that hissed like a chorus of disapproving whispers. The wolf ignored them all. It walked with its head high, not the submissive slink of a domesticated dog, but the easy confidence of a creature exactly where it chose to be. The scars from the arrow wound stood out against its silver ruff, a badge of honor in a language these people couldn't yet understand. Ethan, the blacksmith, found his voice first, his calloused hands flexing at his sides. That thing killed 3 of Jacob's sheep last week. A lie. Ethan knew the work of the new mountain lion, the ragged tears in the throats, the tracks too small to be his companions. But before he could speak, the wolf did something extraordinary. It sat, not at Ethan's feet like a pet, but beside him like an equal. Then, with deliberate slowness, it rolled onto its back, exposing the vulnerable belly, not in submission, but in a display so antithetical to wolf nature that a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The thick scar from the bear attack stretched across its underside, a roadmap of sacrifice no animal would show unless it felt absolute security. Little Mara broke from her mother's grip. Her tiny boots left hurried tracks in the snow as she ran forward, her mittens outstretched. The village collectively held its breath, fathers reaching for belt knives, mothers preparing to cover their children's eyes. The wolf rolled upright and met the girl at her level, lowering its massive head until their foreheads touched. Mara's giggle rang like chapel bells in the crystalline air. "She remembers you," Ethan murmured. The girl had been lost in last winter's blizzard, found curled against the wolf's warmth beneath a pine tree. Now her small fingers buried themselves in the thick winter fur without hesitation. A shudder ran through the gathered crowd, not fear now, but something more profound. The blacksmith's wife crossed herself. The miller's son dropped to his knees in the snow. Old man Harkin's face crumpled like parchment as he turned away, but not before Ethan saw the wetness in his eyes. The lesson unfolded without words. When the wolf led Ethan to the fresh mountain lion kill at the settlement's edge, the same beast that had been taking livestock, its muzzle still wet with predator blood. When it stood guard all night after little Peter fell through the ice, its howls bringing help while its body heat kept the boy alive. When it brought the lost Thompson baby back, carrying the swaddled bundle as gently as a mother with her pup, the village learned what Ethan already knew. Loyalty wasn't domesticated. It wasn't bred or beaten into submission. It was earned in shared survival, in mutual respect that transcended species. By spring, the first offerings appeared at Ethan's gate, not for him, but for his companion. A braided leather collar from the tanner, never worn, a deerskin blanket from the weaver, dutifully dragged inside. and from old man Harkin himself, a single eagle feather tied with red string, an apology decades overdue. The wolf took none of these gifts for itself, but Ethan often woke to find them arranged in careful patterns, the feather placed beside his rifle, the blanket folded near the hearth, messages in a language only they shared. And when the wolf lifted its voice in the moonlit hours, the village no longer barred their shutters. They listened, and in that listening began to remember what their ancestors had known, that the wild was not something to be conquered but conversed with. Time had carved its passage into Ethan's bones. The man who once moved through the forest like a shadow now walked with the measured pace of weathered oak, steady but bearing the weight of seasons. His hands, once swift with knife and bow, trembled slightly as he stoked the evening fire. Yet the ritual remained unchanged, the careful arrangement of kindling, the first bloom of flame, the way his gaze instinctively sought the tree line as dusk painted the world in violet and gold. The answering call always came just as the first star pierced the twilight. It began as a vibration in the earth, a deep resonance that traveled up through the soles of his boots before it reached his ears. Then the howl itself, rising from the high ridge like a silver thread stitching heaven to earth, not the frantic cry of a hunting pack, nor the territorial declaration of an alpha. This was something rarer, a song without words, a story told in sustained notes that shimmered in the cooling air. Ethan closed his eyes and let the music flow through him. In that moment, the years fell away like autumn leaves. He was young again, kneeling in bloody snow before a wounded wolf, middle-aged, standing back to back with his companion against human malice. Older still, watching with quiet pride as the wolf gently herded lost children home. The howl tapered into silence, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the distant chuckle of the spring-fed creek. Ethan reached for the carved wooden bowl at his side, the one with the wolf's teeth marks still visible along the rim, and raised it in salute toward the darkening ridge. A shadow detached itself from the tree line. The wolf moved with the stiff grace of ancient warriors who refused to acknowledge their limitations. Its muzzle had gone nearly white, and the once powerful shoulders now carried the memory of muscle rather than its fullness. Yet the eyes burned with undimmed intelligence as it crossed the clearing with deliberate steps. It no longer slept at Ethan's feet. Tonight, as on so many others, it settled beside his chair, not touching, but near enough that their warmth mingled in the crisp air. The firelight painted its fur in shifting hues of copper and bronze, each scar telling stories more vivid than any village bard could conjure. Ethan's gnarled fingers found the spot behind its ears, where the fur grew unusually soft. The wolf leaned into the touch with a sigh that spoke of decades of such quiet communion. They had outlived the skeptics, the trappers who called them unnatural, the children who had grown and moved away, taking their wonder with them. Even old man Harkin rested beneath a stone now, his eagle feather still tucked in the rafters of Ethan's cabin. Yet this remained, not master and beast, not even man and animal, simply two old warriors sharing the last light, their bond honed sharper by time rather than dulled. When the wolf suddenly lifted its head, Ethan didn't need to follow its gaze to know what it saw. The northern lights had awakened, great spectral banners undulating across the sky in colors no dye could replicate. The wolf's howl rose to meet them, weaving between the shimmering curtains like a living thing. Ethan added his own voice, the cracked tenor of age blending with the wolf's baritone in harmonies older than language. Their duet carried across the sleeping valley, through the abandoned trappers' huts and the overgrown pastures, past the new settlement where electric lights now burned all night. Let the young ones dismiss it as superstition. Let the scholars debate animal consciousness in their stuffy halls. Here, at the world's wild heart, truth needed no explanation. As the last note faded, the wolf rested its muzzle on Ethan's knee. Its breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of his own. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a younger wolf answered the call, its voice bright with the promise of stories yet to unfold. this story isn't just about a man and a wolf, it's about defying prejudice, trusting the unlikely, and discovering that loyalty isn't taught, it's earned. Did this story change your perspective on animals? Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Would you have trusted the wolf?